literature. My name is Dr. Fouzi Slisli, and I will be talking to you today about the causes of the Renaissance. Our first topic, we will look at the Reformation, the famous topic, the Reformation, basically the religious wars that happened in Europe in the 14th and 15th century and led to the Renaissance. So the main points in this lecture are basically they will try to explain to you the causes and the consequences of the Renaissance. We will see that before the Reformation, we will look at the causes and consequences of the Reformation. Before the Reformation, all Christians in Europe were Roman Catholic. After the Reformation, Europe became that European unity doesn't exist anymore. It disappeared for good. So Europeans became divided between Catholics and Protestants and Lutherans and Calvinists and so on. So that religious unity that Europe had before the Reformation disappeared once and for all. Also another important point, the Reformation started a huge attack on the medieval church, on the institutions of the church, and attacks on the doctrines and the practices and the ideas of the church, and also attacks on the personnel of the church, the priests, the monks, and so on. This is a new culture in Europe. Before the Reformation, there was nobody could attack the church or insult the church or criticize the church. The Reformation brought the church under intense attacks from various quarters. The other very important point as far as the Reformation is concerned is that the Reformation caused a split in Christianity with the formation of the Protestant religion. So what we call today the Protestant religion was formed as a result of the Reformation. These are the main points that will come out of this lecture. So let's look now at the details a little bit. First, what was the state of the medieval church? In the medieval period, before the Reformation, the mission of the church was to save the souls of all the members of society, right? The church has a mission to save their souls by trying to control how they live, how they pray, how they work, how they worship, how they eat. Almost all the details of their lives was under strict scrutiny from the church, because the church said that it had the mission to save the soul of the population. Also, during the medieval period, this is before the Reformation, the church practiced what was called the tithe, which is in Arabic we call it al-ushr, the tithe. People essentially had to donate, by law, people had to give 1/10 of their income or their produce, if they are farmers, to the church every year. So the church had a right to 1/10 of everybody's income. This is a practice that will end with the Reformation. Also during the medieval period, before the Reformation, the church was the wealthiest group in Europe. Nobody was as rich as the Catholic Church. Also during the medieval period, the church was the center of daily life. All daily life across Europe, the center of this daily life was the church. The local church in people's villages served as a church, as a meeting place, as a shelter in war. So it was the center of everyday life. Also, during the medieval period, the Catholic Church also was the community. It provided the sense of community. There was no community outside the Catholic Church. So the church dominated community life and controlled the way Christians interacted with each other. Their interaction with each other had to go through the activities that were organized by the church. So by the end of the medieval period, just before the Reformation, the Catholic Church accumulated a number of problems. What are these problems? Very briefly, the Church was accused, was becoming, everybody could see in Europe that the Church was becoming greedy and corrupt. There is a problem of greed, corruption, and absenteeism. When I say absenteeism, meaning that the Church is absent from people's problems. The Church takes 10% of people's income, but then when people have problems, like for example there is famine or there is an earthquake, the Church doesn't come to help people. It's an absentee institution. The Church is the government, but it's a government that's absent from people's problems. This church government comes to take people's money when it's time to pay taxes, but when it's time to like deal with people's problems, the Church is absent. There was also something that a practice called the sales of indulgences. This is a practice that angered many people in Europe. Basically, the Church told people that your soul is damned in hell. It's in hell unless you pay and buy these indulgences. In Arabic we call them sukuk al-ghufran. These are indulgences that people had to buy. By law you have to buy it, so you save your soul. And it was just a huge abuse of church power, and essentially a process of extortion of money from poor people. Again, this became, a problem of the Church. People were resentful and unhappy about this practice. There was also an unfair land distribution. So the way that the land was distributed by the Church was also very unfair. So people who were in the Church were favored and got the best lands and the biggest land, but average and poor people were always disfavored. There was also a huge corruption within the papacy. The papacy is the institution of the Pope. There was huge corruption, and also it created a lot of anger from the populations in Europe. The European population at the end of the medieval period, before the Reformation, the European population was also becoming anti-clerical. People more and more became anti-church, anti-clerical. They opposed church practices, they opposed the people who worked for the church, and so on. This is called anti-clericalism. So the population of Europe was becoming anti-clerical. There was also the problem of absenteeism. The Catholic Church during the medieval period would tax people heavily, but then in times of natural disasters like the plague or the famine, the Church was absent. The Church wouldn't come to help people deal with these huge problems, and the Church doesn't participate in solving the everyday problems of people. Also, by the 14th and 15th century, among the things that contributed to the Reformation was a change in the socio-economic conditions of the time. This is a time, the 14th century was a time when the populations of Europe were becoming better educated. They were becoming more urban, meaning that they live in cities as opposed to farmers who live in the countryside. They were becoming more critical of the Church, and than they were before when they lived in the countryside. Also, this is a time when clashes were developing between the European monarchs, the kings of Europe, and the Church. There was tension and clashes between them, and the European kings and monarchs were becoming more and more impatient with the corruption and the oppression of the Church. So also society in general in Europe at this time was becoming more humanistic and secular, which means that society more and more focuses on life issues rather than salvation issues. Because when you talk about When salvation issues dominate, it's the church that dominates life, the economy, and everything. But when secular and humanistic aspects of life are people's interests, then the church doesn't have a place in those. There is also a growing individualism. More and more people are becoming individualistic. There is also technological developments taking place in this period. There is scientific developments and discoveries that contradict the church doctrine, that contradict what the church says. So the new scientific and technological development contradict the main principles of the main ideas of the church. So the church is finding itself in one place and scientific development is in another place. This is also the time when printing was invented, what is called the movable type. This is the time when printing was invented. And of course with printing, it's very easy to publish books, to distribute them. There is a bigger reading public. More and more people can read, more and more books are available, and of course this will have a huge impact on the culture and the future of Europe. This is also a time when the manufacture of paper became easier and cheaper, so the production of books became cheaper and easier. Of course, this is also the time when ideas spread faster than the church can control them. Before, there was paper, which by the way was brought by the Muslims to Europe in Al-Andalus. It's the Muslims who started paper mills in Al-Andalus back in the 10th and 11th century. But by the 13th, 14th century, paper becomes available in Europe. So there is paper mill factories, and paper is becoming easy to produce and cheap. And of course, when you have paper and you have printing and you can produce books, that means that ideas can spread fast, and the church cannot control the spread of those ideas. There is also at this time more and more intense criticism of the church and church practices. People feel more courageous and bold to criticize the church and what the church does. Excuse me. There is also the development of Protestantism, Protestant ideals, which we will talk about them in a minute, that became more and more appealing and attractive to the urban population in the cities and people who are literate and educated. So, because of these problems that the church had, because of these technological, scientific, and sociological development, increased wealth, there was printing, paper, all of this, there are calls for reforms in Europe at this point. In the 14th and 15th century, in many places in Europe, in Germany, in Switzerland, in France, in Italy, people are calling for reform, Islah. They want reform of their political institutions and of their religion. So the Reformation, the calls to reform, right? Reformation in Arabic, it's Islah. And the reform that they want is a reform of the Christian religion as it was practiced in Europe. Basically, in these calls of reform, the political power of the church starts being challenged and questioned, because you have to remember that the church is not only controlling people's life in terms of religion, but is also the government. The church is the government. So the power of the church in government is starting to become challenged. More and more, we see people unwilling to depend on the church, and there is a rejection of the constraints and the limitations that the church imposed on people's life. There is more and more growing human confidence. People are becoming confident in their capabilities, and more they are liberating themselves from the church idea of the original sin, which, you know, the Catholic Church told people that you have committed an original sin and you are on earth to pay for your sins, right? So more and more people are confident in their capabilities. More and more people say that they're not bound by the idea of the original sin. Also, the Catholic Church becomes more and more defensive and unable to respond to criticism. It fails to answer this criticism. And this is all mainly due to the confusing nature of church dogma. Church dogma was never clear anyway. And the culture of scholasticism that the church used, they used this philosophical tradition called as scholasticism. This is the dominant tradition of the medieval period. So it was confusing. People felt confused with that. I want to give you a little bit some information about the major reformers. So we have the church has problems. There is the economic and political and sociological developments, invention of printing, scientific discoveries, and people call for reforms. I want to give you some examples of these reformers. Some of the most famous ones is Desiderius Erasmus, just famous for as Erasmus. He was Dutch. He was born in 1466 and died in 1536. He was Dutch from Holland. He was a scholar, a humanist and theologian. He was ordained as a Catholic priest, but he never practiced priestly duties. He was never practicing priest, but he was ordained by the church. He studied instead of practicing as a priest, he studied theology and classical Greek at the universities of Paris and Cambridge. He was very critical of some of the practices and doctrines of the Catholic Church, and he sought to reform the Catholic Church. His most important work is called In Praise of Folly. Folly meaning madness. In Praise of Folly. It was written in 1509. It became a bestseller. Only the Bible sold more than this book by 1550. So it was a bestseller. It was read widely. Erasmus was a devout Catholic. He just wanted to reform the church. He didn't want to destroy the church. He just wanted to reform it, Islah. He criticized the immorality and the hypocrisy of church leaders and of the clergy. And also the book, In Praise of Folly, this book inspired renewed calls for reform and influenced major reformers like Martin Luther, whom I would like to talk about now. So the second most important reform figure in the Reformation is, of course, Martin Luther. He was born in 1483 and he died in 1546. So he lived towards the end of the 15th century and the first half of the 16th century. He was a German priest. He openly addressed the problems in the church. He addressed them directly. He didn't mince his word or hint or, just try to go around the bush. He basically told the church, here is the problems that you have and here is the changes that you need to do. He said that faith is private and that the church should have no control over it. In October 31st of October of 1517, Martin Luther posted his famous 95 theses, 95 demands. He put them on a piece of paper and went to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany, and he nailed these 95 demands, nailed them on the door of the church. He made a statement. These are our 95 demands. We want them to apply them. The 95 theses, they summarized his criticism of the church. thousands of copies were distributed throughout Germany and throughout Europe. And immediately the Reformation begins. This is how the Reformation began, essentially. In 1521, Luther was calling for Germany to split from the Catholic Church. He said Germany should not stay under the control of the Catholic Church in Rome. Germany should have its own religion. He wanted German priests to overthrow papal power, meaning the power of the Pope in Germany, and he called on German priests to establish their own German church. In January of 1521, Luther was excommunicated, meaning that the church declared him non-Christian. He was excommunicated from the church. He was expulsed from the church. He was summoned by imperial diet, which they call it's an imperial order. He was summoned by an imperial order of the Holy Roman Empire to the city of Worms by Emperor Charles V. He was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, Charles V. He was young and inexperienced, so he was also not very skillful in dealing with the situation. So he called on Martin Luther, told him to come to the city of Worms, and called him and asked him to renounce his 95 theses and change his ideas. Martin Luther said basically, no, I will not change. And the famous Edict of Worms, or the order, it's an edict that the emperor issued, making Martin Luther an outlaw. From this point, Martin Luther became an outlaw. He was kept in hiding by German princes who were sympathetic to his ideas and who shared his desire to split and take independence from the Catholic Church. From this point, from the moment Martin Luther was thrown out of the Catholic Church and made an outlaw, Lutheranism started spreading. From Lutheranism, Protestantism is going to develop, but at this point they are still not calling it Protestantism. They still just call it Lutheranism. Their Lutheranism is a reference to the followers of Martin Luther's religious practices. It increased all over Europe. Protestantism gained support among many German princes and German kings. In 1524, for example, German peasants, farmers in Germany, revolted. It's known as the Peasant Revolt. These peasants hoped that Martin Luther would come to their support and support their revolt, but he chose not to. And Martin Luther chose not to support the peasants because he needed the support of the German princes, and he did not want to help the peasants. He needed the support of the German princes. This is in a way, it's recorded in history as a failure of German Luther to stand by his words. He always campaigned for poor people and the peasants, but when the peasants revolted, he failed to come to their support because he depended on German princes. So at this point, Germany is in turmoil. It's not clear if it is Catholic, is it Lutheran, it's not clear. Germany is in turmoil, there is instability. To establish peace, because of this instability, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, accepted the Peace of Augsburg, the Peace of Augsburg Treaty, which allowed German princes to choose their own faith and their own religion. So from this point, Germany splits from the Catholic Church and has the right to have its own religion. Protestantism continues spreading across Europe. Essentially, this is the Reformation. Protestantism spread across Europe. Some of the main names that spread Protestantism in Europe include Ulrich Zwingli, and his campaign is known in history as the Zwinglian Reformation. There is also John Calvin and Calvinism. Calvinism is very popular in America today. And there is, of course, Henry VIII, the English king Henry VIII, who also will split from the Catholic Church and start the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, and allowed England to have its own religion separate from the Catholic Church in Rome. So I'm going to just give you a brief overview of these three figures. First, we have Ulrich Zwingli. He was born in 1484, the last 10 years of the 15th century, and he died in 1531, meaning the first 30 years of the 16th century. His movement is called the Zwinglian Reformation. He was a priest in Zurich, in Switzerland. He revolted against the Catholic Church. He banned all religious relics. Relics are essentially objects that the church held as sacred. So they can be books, they can be pieces of hair, they can be bottles, they can be tables, relics. They're called relics. And people would come to pray to these relics. So Zwingli banned the relics. He said, that's it, we will no more accept the use of relics in our religion. Or images, also images. You notice, for example, how Catholic churches, for example, in Italy or Spain or France, they have a lot of statues and images. Zwingli banned the use of images and statues. He also whitewashed all the interior walls of the church. He wanted them just white. No colors, no decorations, nothing. He banned music from church service. He does not allow music in church services, which was the practice under the Catholic Church. But Zwingli did not merge with Martin Luther. He disagreed with Martin Luther because he disagreed with him on the idea of communion. Martin Luther accepted communion. Zwingli did not accept communion. Another important figure that helped spread the Reformation is the famous John Calvin. John Calvin. He's very important, especially in the United States today, because there is a huge number of Calvinists and Calvinist church all over the United States. John Calvin and Calvinism, he was born in 1509, the first decade of the 16th century, and he died in 1564. He replaced Zwingli. He was essentially a follower of Zwingli, and when Zwingli was killed in religious war, this is a time where there is a lot of religious wars. There is a lot of sectarian religious wars. Catholics are being, in countries that are Protestant, Catholics are being oppressed and killed and displaced. In countries that are Catholics, Protestants are being oppressed and thrown away and killed and so on. So Zwingli was killed in a religious war. He was replaced by John Calvin. John Calvin was French. He fled to Switzerland for safety because, you know, he was French, was a Catholic country, and Calvin is Protestant. They were killing Catholics in France, Protestants in France. So he fled to Switzerland for safety, and he replaced Zwingli. He became the head of the Zwinglian reform movement. In 1536, he began reforming Geneva in Switzerland. He created a church government. He called it a church government of elect people, meaning elect people who are priests, and laity. Laity meaning the average common people. So he combined average common people and priests and created a church government in Geneva in Switzerland. He used consistory. He called them the consistory. It's like the moral police. People, it's a police that walks in the street and makes sure that people respect the religious issues. He sent missionaries, he sent missionaries throughout Europe to convert Catholics to Protestantism, to Calvinism. His ideas spread to France, Netherlands, and Scotland. In the middle of the 16th century, Calvinism was more popular even than Lutheranism. So already Calvinism is becoming the biggest streak of Protestantism in the middle of the 16th century. John Calvin was anti-Catholic. He wasn't somebody who wanted to coexist with Catholicism. He wanted to completely erase Catholicism. So he was anti-Catholic. He was influenced by Martin Luther, but he disagreed with Martin Luther that salvation through faith, Martin Luther's idea of salvation through faith alone. Calvin believed that salvation is also based on actions. Martin Luther believed salvation can happen only through faith. Calvin said no, it's faith plus actions. John Calvin established his own Protestant religion in Switzerland. To give you an idea about the spread of Protestantism, Calvinism at this point started in Switzerland. In England and America, it gave us the Puritans, the movement we call the Puritans. They're the ones who went to America and settled the first English colonies in the America were settled by Puritans. Well, these Puritans were followers of John Calvin. In Scotland, the followers of John Calvin became known as the Presbyterians, and today we have the Presbyterian Church is all over the United States. In Holland, John Calvin's followers created the Dutch Reform movement, or the Dutch Reformed Church. In France, Calvin's followers became known as the Huguenots. They're the Protestants of France. France is a majority Catholic country. The minority followers of John Calvin became known as the Huguenots. And in Germany, Calvin's followers became known as the Reformed Church. In South Africa, where the Dutch created the colony in South Africa, the followers of John Calvin were the majority of the colonists, and they were called the Boers. So as you can see, Calvinism and the ideas of John Calvin, the Calvinist Reformation, spread not only across Europe, but even in America and South Africa. Some of the main ideas of Calvinism, they believed in predestination, for example. Calvinism believes that at birth, when people are born, it is decided and determined whether they're gonna go to hell or to heaven. It's decided at birth. It doesn't matter what they do in their life, if they're good people or bad people. It's predestined whether they go to hell or whether they go to heaven. Calvinists also preached a purified existence. For example, they're opposed to drinking. They're against alcohol, completely against alcohol. They're against gambling, and they're against card playing. They're also against swearing, using swear words. So they're puritanical in that sense. Another example was England. I want to talk to you about the example of King Henry VIII and England. This is a different example because this reformation in England happened because of political questions, not religious issues. It wasn't a religious reformation, it was a political dispute, a political fight that eventually became a religious reformation. What happened is that King Henry VIII was King of England, and he needed a male to be a heir to the throne. He wanted a son to be a king of England after him, and to be the king of the Tudor. This is the Tudor dynasty. He wanted a son to be king of this Tudor dynasty. He married first a lady called Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was an aunt. She was the aunt of Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, right? So the Holy Roman Emperor, his aunt, Catherine of Aragon is married to King Henry VIII of England. Catherine gives Henry VIII a daughter, but no son. He wanted a son. So Henry wanted to divorce the aunt of the Roman Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor. But of course, as you probably know, the Catholic Church doesn't allow divorce. You can't divorce in the Catholic Church. So Henry VIII wants divorce. There is conflict. Only the Pope can grant the king a divorce, but the Pope in this instant refuses to grant Henry VIII the divorce, especially that the wife of Henry VIII is the Emperor's aunt. The Pope refused to grant the annulment of this marriage, and there is a standoff, there is a conflict between the King of England and the Holy Roman Emperor in Rome. After a long argument, Henry VIII decided to break away from the Catholic Church. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the religious guy in Canterbury in England, he granted Henry VIII the divorce. And the Act of Supremacy, it's called the Act of Supremacy of 1534, established the Church of England. What we know today, what we call today the Church of England, was established as a result of this dispute over divorce between King Henry VIII and the Holy Roman Emperor. The Act of Supremacy was passed in 1534. The King of England, now controls over religious doctrine and religious appointments. He appoints the priests, he appoints the clergy, and everything that has to do with the church. King Henry VIII dissolved Catholic claims. For example, he sold the land that was owned by the Catholic Church. All the land that the Catholic Church owned in England, he dissolved it and sold the land. And all its possessions. He took power essentially, but I mean, in terms of religion, Henry VIII remained Catholic in his beliefs. He just didn't want to be part of the Protestant, of the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church in Rome. Henry, but still, his problem is still there. He still needs a son. And he wanted the son so bad that he married 6 wives, right? 6 wives. And each one, no one would give him a son, so he killed some of them. He killed one of his wives, he beheaded another, he divorced another, so much that the English have a saying now about this story, a saying that says, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. This is an English saying about King Henry VIII and his 6 wives. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It's a reference to the 6 wives of King Henry VIII. In 1547, Henry VIII died. In 1547. He had a 9-year-old son at this time, Edward VI. So Edward VI, at the age of 9, he took the throne of England. The Church of England, or the Anglican Church, became more Protestant at this point, right? So it started breaking away from the Catholic Church in Rome and becoming Protestant, which triggered the anger of the Catholic Church. In 1553, Edward VI died. His half-sister, Mary, who was Catholic, became queen. Mary, Queen of England, was Catholic. So Mary wanted to restore Catholicism back in England. She killed over 300 Protestants. She burned them. She burned them at the stake as heretics. She burned them because she said they were heretics. And it earned her the title of Bloody Mary. This is why in English history Queen Mary is known as Bloody Mary because she burned over 300 people at the stake. Mary increased tension between Protestants and Catholics in England, and it lasted until she died, and then her sister Elizabeth came to power, and this gives us the Elizabethan period, which is famous for Elizabethan literature and so on. So this is essentially how the Reformation happened in Europe. The next lecture will look at the conditions, the causes of the Renaissance as far as the economic and technological aspects of life are concerned. So thank you so much for following this lecture, and I will see you in the next one. Assalamu alaikum.